Welcome to the Ranchonomics podcast, where we empower you to build a better ranch and transform your operations into a thriving business. I'm your host, John Haskell. Let's get started. Good morning and welcome to the Ranchonomics podcast. I am very lucky today to be joined by my good friend, Wally Olson, and another friend, Kim Barker. And Kim Barker, welcome to the Ranchonomics podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Good. And Wally, thanks for joining us again. Nice to see you.
It's going to be fun as usual. So
that's right. I've invited Kim here to talk about a couple of things. And Kim, I'd like to start. Let's start by talking about having your kids come home. Kim is kind of later in his career and has been going through a succession process for a number of years. And I love the way Kim thinks about things. And so I invited him on here to kind of get an idea of the way he thinks. But where I'd like to start is with, how do you bring kids home to an operation? So Kim, do you mind starting there?
Okay. Well, I've got 3 daughters, and one of them works Tinker Air Force Base 3 hours away, and then the other 2 are here. And my youngest daughter came home. She went off to college and got a degree in business and came home in 2014. So I've got some thoughts about what it takes to get your kids to come home. And first of all, I think you have to have something of value for them to come home to.
Totally agree.
And I don't mean monetary value. I mean, that's important too, but I mean, they need to be able to express their value.
Yep.
You know, and kids today, or at least my kids, are way more aware of health concerns and social concerns than I ever was. So their values are, even though they grew up here and we raised them, well, there's still some differences there, and we have to allow for that.
Yep. So what you're saying is, just because something was your goal doesn't mean it's their goal. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Right.
And your interests aren't necessarily their interests. So
right.
Giving them a place where they can really do their own thing is what you're trying to create, right?
Right.
Okay.
And I think some of us have been doing this a long time, and we've learned a lot of things that don't work without necessarily learning things that do work. And about the time we get things figured out, we run out of energy. So to have the young folks coming home with young minds and young energy is a tremendous plus. But you've got to allow them to focus where they want to focus. And the older generation's got to learn to teach and to share their knowledge and their wisdom. And we're not all good teachers. And the younger folks have to ask lots of questions. My daughters were relentless. They still are. They're pushy. They're fearless about asking questions. And we have to let them be that way. I mean, I want them to be that way. I don't ever want to say, well, just because I said so. That's never the right answer. So my daughters constantly ask me, why do we do that? Why are you doing that? And sometimes I know, and sometimes I'm in a rut. I got to think about it. I got to go back and go, okay, why do I do that? Usually there's a good reason, but.
Have they been that way since they were little, or has this emerged more as they're adults?
Well, they're getting braver. They're getting more fearless about pushing to get what they want. So, but I encourage them. I mean, I want them to be that way. You know, if you're going to be defensive about answering questions, well, there's going to be trouble. And they ask because they want to know. And even though they grew up here, when they come back here, they're on a lot of learning curves. You know, we've been cell grazing since 1990, and we've been direct marketing for a while, and so they come home and they want to learn all this stuff, but there's a whole bunch of learning curves there. You know, I didn't learn it all quick, and they're not going to either. So we got to allow for that.
And a lot of that childhood experience is useful, but it's amazing how different experience as an adult is, right?
Right. And Lacey doesn't just want to know. I mean, she gets kind of aggravated if I make a decision without her, because she wants to know everything that went into making that decision. What was I thinking about? Not just how did I get there, but what all went through my mind. And that's kind of hard to quantify sometimes.
Do you ever find yourself reversing a decision because of her why questions?
Well, we change things. I mean, I don't know about reversing decisions, but we're changing things and adapting to what the girls need to do and what works for all of us now. I mean, I'm an old man, and setting my ways and having this young energy around and young minds around is tremendous. But it means that they come up with things that I don't want to do that, you know. Well, okay, we're not going to do that. And that's one of the things when when they came home and we were direct marketing pork and chicken and beef and eggs and all kinds of stuff. And I asked them, I said, what do you want to do? And so the pigs had to go because they didn't want to do that, even though they were very profitable. But they were just on too many learning curves. They didn't want to try to do everything, which you can't. So that's good. And the other thing I would say is as an older generation, probably younger one too, we got to be more patient than we've ever been in our life. Patient with questions and patient, everybody learns by making mistakes. So you got to allow for mistakes. And then, us old guys, we tend to want to teach what to do and how to do it. And the why is much more important. And once you've got a good why, you can figure out what to do and how to do it. I mean, there's lots of ways to do things. There's no one right way, but why you're doing it is important. And we can't necessarily teach that. It doesn't have to be the same why that for me and her both, but she needs to figure out a why for herself. And then Lacey's told me on a couple different occasions that I've never stopped her from trying something new, that anything she wants to try, I let her try. And I've always answered her questions. And she says, I've always been very generous with my time and with my opportunities and with our answering questions and even education. I've been involved with Wally for decades on grazing land boards and things like that. We've done lots of seminars and brought in lots of really good speakers. So we've got this huge network of people. So I'm doing everything I can that they will have that huge network of people, of their own. But they've already tapped into mine. But to me, that's one of the most important things that come out of my life is this network of people all over the world. And I think we need to be inspiring young people that have energy and enthusiasm and desire to do things instead of squashing that and say, no, you got to do it this way. We need to be inspiring them to find their own way and also do everything we can to make it happen. And then, over time, eventually, you get to take turns being the boss. The girls will say, well, you need to go do this. And I'll say, okay, but you got to go do this. And life is good and you can all relax. Oh, I met Alan Savory in 1988. He came to Woodward Research Station, gave a presentation, and I was 37 years old. And I never even started thinking till then. And my daughters had been back here a while, and I think Lacey was about 28 when this thought occurred to me that she knows about 1,000 times more at 28 than I knew at 37. So I think we're in pretty good shape.
Well, and Wally, I've heard you repeat Chip Hines's line, right? Over and over again about how important it is to put an old head on young shoulders.
Yes.
And you ran into Savory you said 88? That's pretty early in the world of holistic management, right? I think about, you at your stage in life and what you have learned, and your daughters at their stage in life and the energy that they have. And man, when you put those two things together, that's a pretty powerful combination, right?
It can be if you work together and allow them to have their say, This wouldn't work if I was a tyrant and a boss. This only works because they get to be the boss.
And, one thing you got to understand is they're going to, we made mistakes and they're going to make mistakes, and you just got to fix them. Don't get upset about it, just fix them. And like everybody says, how can you put animals out like I do with people? And I said, well, I realize they probably won't make, hopefully, as many mistakes as I did, because I hopefully will help them through it,
Because if we're honest, we've all made lots of mistakes, right?
Well, or else you haven't done much,
Right.
Those are the lessons we learn that we retain the most is the mistakes we made.
Yeah. And I think it's really important. There's another important principle that I learned through horsemanship and stockmanship, and I've tried to apply it with my kids, which is this idea that I can make myself part of the problem when something goes wrong, or I can sort of stay out of it a little bit and just let the problem do the teaching. And my kids are younger than yours, but when we screw something up, we just had a deal the other day where we dumped milk all over the floor. Well, what do? We made a mistake, we clean it up, and we start again, so we can get upset about it. We can jump up and down and, be mad, or we can just clean it up and move on. And I think we're best off if we clean it up and move on. And if I don't get upset in the process, then the milk is the teacher. I don't have to be. Running a ranch is more than just hard work. It's about vision, strategy, and execution. That's why ranching.fyi exists, to help ranchers make smarter decisions every day. With access to cutting-edge resources, online forums, and events tailored to the challenges ranchers face, ranching.fyi helps you stay ahead of the game. If you're ready to grow your operation and connect with other ranchers, head over to ranching.fyi today and see how this platform can transform your business. Excellent. All right, keep going.
Well, I've been on a quest for years. I keep thinking there's a cattle that will make it here without me doing much. Well, I've tried lots of different breeds and lots of different things, and I've always been one to try things and make my own mistakes. And so I certainly am going to allow my kids. And we've always tried to be a low-cost producer. And to do that, fertility and stocking rate are the two most important things. Fertility is the most important genetic trait, and stocking rate is the most important management trait or management thing. So I think you have to understand that before you can move forward. But going into how my daughters got started here, I had a stroke in 2010, and my middle daughter moved back shortly after that time, and I wasn't ready.
How old were you in 2010, Kim?
58.
Okay, so, you were young for having a stroke.
Well, I thought so.
Yeah. Still in the prime of your working life, right?
Yeah, I thought so.
Yep.
But Julie came home, and I wasn't ready. I mean, I didn't know what to do with her, and, I could use the help, but I was not ready to take on somebody. So that didn't go well. It was okay. She had a job in town. She wasn't dependent on me anyway.
And describe a little what you mean by that didn't go well.
Well, it just could have been smoother. I wasn't prepared to teach, and I wasn't prepared to give up much as far as decision making and things like that. And I was I'd had a stroke, and I couldn't move my left arm for months, and I didn't know what I was going to be able to do myself. So I didn't know what was going to happen. And then Lacey came home. My mom had Alzheimer's really bad, and she came home and lived with her and helped take care of her. And I paid her with my mom's money to do that. And in the meantime, she's working and learning with me and asking lots of questions. And then in 2014, or in 2011, 12, and 13, we were really dry. Worst, driest I've ever seen in my lifetime. I'd sold about 2/3 of my cows. So in 2014, we leased 135 cows to get her in the cattle business without any debt, because cattle were too high to buy back at that time. I'd been around long enough to know I didn't want to buy $4,000 cows.
Yeah, that was the last time cows were as high as they are now, right? Basically, yeah. 10, 11 years.
And the first time they'd ever been that high, I think.
Yep.
So we leased these cows, and we had a 3-year lease on them. We ended up keeping them for 4. And that enabled Lacey to accumulate about 40 cows free and clear and quite a little bit of cash in the bank. And she came to me after about the 4th year, and she said, "Why do we still have those leased cows?" She said, "I need to be owning cows." And I said, "You're right." So, this was her figuring this out all by herself. So we called the guy and got rid of the leased cows, and then she had her own cows. And then another thing we did about that time was we bought, I don't remember, about 50 heifers and bred them and calved them out and sold half of them. So we had the other half pretty much free and clear. So both my girls had more cows free and clear at that point. And then my dad's aunt passed away, and she was 99 years old, and I'd had her land leased for about 40 years. And one of her daughters wanted to sell her part of that. So there's 240 acres right across the road that we've had for 40 years. And so Lacey bought it. She had the cash and cows paid for, and she bought it without any problem, and all is going well there. So.
And in your part of the world, can the cows that she owned make that payment?
Well, if she pays attention. Yeah. But we're a very low cost producer.
And also, Lacey is very creative because what she does.
Yeah. And then my other daughter, Julie, has bought land also. She's bought my grandparents' home place that's a mile away. And she's not set up quite as good, but we have a plan, and if she sticks with the plan, she'll be great.
But one thing, back to Lacey and her land, there was a house on it, and she Airbnbs it.
Yeah, she turned that into an Airbnb, and it was pretty busy for a while. She got it ready to go by the time COVID hit. So that was kind of a wreck. But as it turns out, there were people that wanted to get out in the country and just sat. I mean, there were people that came here that didn't want to do anything. They just want to be out of town, want to be out by themselves. So we had quite a few of those. There's a state park near here that's the Little Sahara. It's 2,000 acres of dunes, and people come from all the United States to ride their four-wheelers and dune buggies and things. So she had quite a bit of traffic for that. But then things kind of slowed down, so she's now got it just leased out.
Okay.
To have steadier income.
Month-to-month tenant kind of thing.
Yeah. But this way, she doesn't have to clean all the time, too. So Airbnb is fine, but it is work, So that helped.
So she's paying the mortgage with the tenant on the house and the cows, basically. She's got a couple income streams there. Very good. Okay.
And we operate mostly on leased land, and I've turned most of the leases over to her so she can get the benefit of whatever drought programs or whatever's out there to help her a little bit.
Okay. And how much lease? So she owns 40, and then how much land does she lease? Kind of thinking of that ratio.
No, she bought 240.
Bought 240, excuse me. Okay.
Yeah.
And then how much does she lease to run on to go?
No, another 1,000 acres or thereabouts.
Okay. All right. So, and that kind of follows Alan Nation's prescription, right, in Knowledge Rich Ranching, where he talked about leveraging that lease land and the proceeds from it.
I think here you need to have about at least 4 times as much land leased to make a land payment. I mean, around here, land has always been too high priced for agriculture to pay for it. There's always been enough oil and gas around and lately it's been deer hunters. The price of land is way higher than it ought to be for what it'll produce.
And as high as it is in Oklahoma, I'd argue Oklahoma is still one of the more affordable places in the ranch world. Is that fair?
Probably, yeah. But right here, I mentioned the dunes. A lot of our land could be dunes. If we wanted to manage for dunes, we could have dunes.
Okay.
We've got 2 extremes of soil. We've got really tight red clay and really deep, coarse sand.
And how do you guys get along on that sand grazing?
Well, I've learned a few things. Parts of it that we have kangaroo rats here and gophers. And if you're just grazing it at a traditional 1 cow to 10 or 12 acres, a lot of it would get pretty fluffy. The gopher and sand rats just keep it fluffed up. And I've found that by grazing it at pretty high density and keeping it packed down, that's way more conducive to growing grass than it is weeds and brush. And if it's fluffed up, it's more conducive to weeds and brush.
Do you have a lot of trouble with it blowing there?
Well, we keep it covered up, but yeah. I mean, if it was farmed, it would blow. I've been told that either my great-grandfather or my grandfather farmed this half section for a couple of years back in the 30s, plowed the whole thing up, except for a couple of big, tall hills. And there's places where those hills, the tops of them have blown out, where they're just trenches. And those were still bare sand until I started cell grazing in 1990. They didn't heal up till I changed the management.
And after you started cell grazing in 1990, 2 years after you met Alan Savory, how long did it take to get those hills stabilized?
It didn't take very long.
Yeah.
Because I was packing them down some and then letting them rest.
Yeah. Were you feeding on them or were you just grazing them?
No, just grazing them.
Yeah. Interesting.
But mostly I would say it was the rest and the packing it down. But
yeah. Oh, it's amazing how it does it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Good fun.
And then that red clay is a whole other deal because it's so tight you can't get water into it.
Right.
You can't build organic matter in sand very fast.
Right.
And the water just goes right on through it, So the clay, you can't get water in the ground, and the sand, you can't slow it down long enough to use it.
It's nice to have those two right next to each other. That's perfect.
I guess,
Yeah.
If it's feasible, I'd mix them together, but.
Yeah, right. Was that red clay, was it farmed also?
Parts of it, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. My dad's uncle passed away in 1980, and he used to farm with an old farm all tractor and, 10-acre patches. And But as he got older and slowed down, he planted it back to grass.
Yeah.
A patch at a time. So that's really, really good native grass mix because he established it that way before I came along and we managed to keep it.
Love it.
And I think the clay is probably better quality grass than the sand is.
Yeah, sand will darn sure grow you volume if you get things right, but the clay will probably have higher quality. So
yeah. But we're talking about things that, I've been doing all my life. And here Lacey came along 10 years ago and she learned a lot. And Julie has too. They both learned a lot.
Yeah, because 88, that'd be 47 years ago, I guess you met Savory?
Well, not quite. 37.
37. Okay, yep. I guess I'm curious, how hard was it after you, this is a little bit of a tangent, but after you met Savory, how hard was it to sort of see what he was talking about and get started? How much did you kind of have to overcome there?
Well, I grew up here. I've been here my whole life. So when I heard Savory, everything he said just made perfect sense to me with what I was seeing on the land.
Interesting. Okay.
I mean, it just made sense. I mean, he talks about desertification and I was seeing that. So I bought his book, and that first book he wrote was a textbook. You had to want to read that book.
It was a big old thick thing. Yeah.
And I read that thing 6 times, and then I started cell grazing just from reading that book. I didn't know anybody that was doing it. I just started. And then within a couple of years, I met lots of people. I went to the Allen Nations Grazing Conference in Jackson, Mississippi, and Stan Parsons was there, and Gordon Hazard was there. And so I learned a lot pretty fast from that point. And Wally, I met Wally about that time. And so I just met lots of people that were doing lots of crazy things and thought, well, I want to do that too,
Yep. That sounds awesome. All right. Well, we've covered a fair amount of ground here. Is there anything else we want to talk about specific to succession before we wrap up?
Well, you asked me when we talked the other day about you'll know how I think.
Yes.
And I don't know how I think, but I've got Amish friends in Ohio, and every decision they make is based on community and family and religion. And if it violates one of those 3, they just flat don't do it. And I think everybody has something like that they filter decisions through. But I would say that knowing what your values are and what you will do and what you will never do helps guide your decisions and keeps you out of trouble. And that's one of the things the girls have to learn too is what am I never going to do? And Joel Salatin told me one time, until you are willing to say, I will never do it that way, you can never be creative to figure out another way to do it. Because as long as you got a crutch to fall back on, you'll fall back on it. So I think those things are important in how you make decisions. That's more where we started, so I guess I'll end with that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's super important. We've actually been having a discussion on our team about how to make sure we have those values clarified without it turning into, a real airy-fairy kind of navel-gazing exercise, but keeping it practical so that you can make good decisions, right? So you know what your values are, you know what you stand for, you know what you're going to do.
Well, it just eliminates a lot of things right up front, so you don't even have to think about them.
And over again, I find in my life saying no to some things means that I can say yes to the things that are really important.
Right. Well, if you got time for one more quick story, I used to lease a ranch 25 miles away that was 4,000 acres that all laid together. That's the only reason I leased it. I always wanted to manage a place that laid together because this part of Oklahoma is settled by land run. There's lots of quarters and 80s and half sections. And so Lacey had been here a couple of years and she said, you need to get rid of that ranch. And I said, why? And she said, because you spend all your time driving up and down the road and you need to be teaching me. And so I got rid of the ranch and I started focused on teaching her.
And the rest is history.
That was way more important.
Yep. I love it. David Brooks has a book that I love, and it's called From Strength to Strength. And I've referenced this book a few times on this podcast, but I really think for anybody that is 40 or above, it is an incredibly important book to read because what it describes is not only how we decline cognitively and physically, really starting in our 30s, right? And how we can, instead of sort of lamenting our decline, we can actually pivot to our other strength, which is exactly what you've done, right? Which is how much we can mentor other people and how much impact we can have that way. And I think it's very interesting that your journey started with a stroke in your 50s, right? When you really weren't ready. And Brooks's argument is that either we prepare ourselves or we will be prepared. You can be humble or you can be humbled, one or the other. And a lot of times we need that reminder or that wake-up call to kind of help jolt us out of our complacency and get us on kind of the right path, or the path we really need to be on. So, Kim, I am thrilled you joined us today. Thank you very much for being here.
Well, it's been fun. I've enjoyed it.
Good. And I've enjoyed the many things I've learned from you over the years and the wonderful stories you've been willing to share. And so as you have taught your daughters, you've also been willing to teach other people. And I think the rest of us that get to benefit from that have been very, very lucky. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay. We'll talk again. You guys have a great day. Thanks, Wally, for joining us. Thank you for tuning into the Ranchonomics podcast. We hope this episode helped you win today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share it with a friend.